Retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack joins me now from Newport, Rhode Island. He's a former US Defense Attache to Russia. Currently, he is a senior global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for the Scholars, Kennan Institute. General, great to have you here with us on TRT World. So, NATO has backed Ukraine's pursuit of membership for years, going as far back as 2008 Bucharest summit, reaffirming again in 2024 that Ukraine's future is in NATO. But now, when the war has reached a critical point, Washington is dialing back its commitment, calling Ukraine's NATO membership an unrealistic objective. So I think many in Moscow and around the world would argue that NATO's engagement with Ukraine was precisely why Russia attacked in the first place. So was Ukraine led down a path that was never really viable? And is this shift in U.S. policy essentially admitting that NATO expansion was a mistake?
Thank you for bringing on. It's a very, very complex question. The discussion about NATO has a policy that the door is always open. If countries meet what the standards that they set, meaning the NATO door is never closed, and the Russians should know that. No nation can interfere with another nation's foreign policy when it comes to being part of something or whatever would be a NATO view. Ukraine was invaded in 2022 savagely, and we can't lose sight of that. They've taken 20% of Ukrainian lands, a good chunk in 2014, 15, and then, of course, in the last couple of years. So I think that while the negotiations are good to have, we, the West, or their allies or friends, not just the West, their allies and friends should not concede to the Russians that because of Russia's desire to keep Ukraine, who's desperate for a security guarantee. The Ukrainians want, if they can't get NATO, then how do we help guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty, a word the Russians like, in the light of the difficult situation they're in. So I think that we got to let these talks go, and the U.S. and Russia should not be the primary interlocutors for a peace, especially if Ukraine is not part of the discussion or a negotiation that would lead to an actual result.
Right. Now, General, fascinating insights, but I believe what Donald Trump is doing right now is the exact opposite of what you have just stated. For example, we have heard from U.S. officials that Ukraine may have to make concessions to end this war. Some speculate that that might mean formally giving up Crimea territory that Russia annexed by force in 2014. But if Washington is even entertaining the idea of Crimea being handed to Moscow, doesn't that send a signal that military aggression pays off? What precedent does it set for Russia?
Sir, I am absolutely with you with that question. I was in Moscow in the U.S. Embassy when the Russians invaded the first time in 2014 and illegally annexed Crimea. So I have a lot of scar tissue on this. You can't accede, give it away. It is not ours or Europe's. That may be a desire, but the Ukrainians have a major vote for. They have fought their lives for the last 3 years, and they're exhausted, and they have taken terrible casualties, though the Russians have taken much more. There should be a negotiation or a peace, but it's got to be one that Ukraine trusts. And that's why with it needs to come a credible security guarantee, whether it's NATO or a coalition of the willing or something. But they just can't be left hanging out on the eastern frontier of Europe.
And General, with the U.S. Rolling back support, Ukraine being told it won't get NATO membership and Russia demanding control over annexed territories, doesn't this all point to a fractured Ukraine as the most likely outcome? If the best case scenario for Ukraine now involves giving up land and security guarantees that are weaker than NATO membership, was this war essentially fought in vain?
This war was not fought in vain. The modern Ukraine has been born in this horrific war, and I've been there, and it's the entire nation is in a societal fight for survival, facing the Russian invasion. And can we all believe that the North Koreans now are pushing in on Kursk out of Russia? How the world has changed. We should encourage between the Russians and the Ukrainians to figure it out, but not with a sledgehammer or poised over Ukraine's head. Ukraine sees itself as a Western nation, and after 3 years, if they want it, we can't forsake them.
General, before I let you go, very quickly, why do you think Donald Trump is doing all of this? What do you think is his primary motivation behind changing America's policy towards Ukraine?
Well, I can't speak for him, but he has never been, if you will, an internationalist concerning interventions and things like that. We're in and we have been since 1945, 1947, 49, United Nations, the creation of NATO. We have always been part of the world and part of the security fabric of our world, starting first with Russia and Europe. Ukraine is now part of that. Can't the Russians let the Ukrainians survive? What is it about Ukraine that threatens them and makes them so, or makes the leadership so sclerotic?
Right.
I think that we don't want to be in the position, in the collective free-minded nations, of asking ourselves 2 or 3 years from now, who lost Korea? Who lost Ukraine after this really epic defense? And so it's hard.
Very good point there. General Peter Zwack, thanks very much for joining me here on TRT World. I really appreciate your taking out the time.
All the best.